There was a gun on the Soviet space station, an autocannon, 23mm, the same gun the Soviets hung in the tail of a Tupolev bomber, firing 2,500 rounds a minute. It was bolted to the underside of the hull. It had no turret and no gun sight, so the only way to aim it was to rotate the whole station, all 19 tons, until the entire spacecraft pointed at what you wanted to hit. Soviet state media announced the launch that morning as a civilian science laboratory. Almost every word of that was false. June 25, 1974, Baikonur, out on the Kazakh steppe before dawn. A Proton rocket lifts the thing off the pad, and a few hours later the announcement goes out. The Soviet Union has placed a new scientific station in orbit, and its name is Salyut 3. There is talk of research. Its real name was Almaz. It belonged to the military, and its job was photographing NATO installations. The gun was bolted on underneath because somebody in Moscow had thought through what would happen if the Americans came up to interfere with it, and had decided the answer was to shoot at them. That station is gone. It burned up over the Pacific in January 1975, cannon and all. But the design behind it did not burn up. A descendant of it is in orbit tonight with Americans asleep inside, and nobody puts that in the video about the space gun. The Soviet government did not merely cancel this program, it deleted it. The cover name, the classification, the official silence, the whole apparatus of not telling. So when I say almost nobody knows what Almaz was, I'm not doing the thing where a narrator tells you a famous story is secret. Making sure you didn't know was somebody's actual job, and they were good at it. And the erasure worked so well it fooled everybody about which part of the program was worth anything. Everyone remembers the gun. The gun is a trivia answer. The part that mattered was the freight truck nobody bothered to photograph. What Almaz actually was, then. Why the civilian space station program you've heard of was built out of the military one you haven't. The 3 stations and the 3 crews, the piece of it that's still up there, and the day they fired the gun. December 10, 1963. 11 years before that Proton leaves the pad, the United States Air Force announces the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, a crude military station with a Gemini capsule bolted on top and a Titan rocket underneath. Reconnaissance satellites already existed. But the belief at the time, on both sides, was that a human being up there aiming the camera, picking the target, deciding in the moment what was worth the film, would beat any machine that just flew a track and photographed whatever passed beneath it. The Soviets read the announcement. And in 1964, a design bureau outside Moscow called OKB-52, run by Vladimir Chelomei, started building the answer. Chelomei did not build a modest one. Almaz was a pressurized cylinder, about 14.5 meters long and just over 4 meters across at the widest point, weighing nearly 19 tons at launch, with around 90 cubic meters of habitable volume inside it. That's roughly the interior of a city bus, in orbit, with 2 men living in it for a month or 2 at a stretch. The wide section was that wide for one reason. It had to swallow an enormous telescope and camera assembly, which was the entire point of the machine. The solar panels, the 2 engines, the docking port, the airlock, all of it existed to serve that optical system. And the optics existed to look at things in Nevada and Norfolk and West Germany. Then, in June 1969, the Americans canceled the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. It never flew a single crew. The reasons on that side were about as glamorous as the reasons usually are. The Vietnam War was eating the budget, first flight kept slipping, and automated satellites had improved to the point where nobody could say clearly what the man in the loop was adding. 6 years of work, 0 missions. So the question Almaz was built to answer had been withdrawn by the people who asked it, and Chelomei's bureau kept building for another 9 years. I don't think that's stupidity, incidentally. Once a program that size is moving, with a factory and a workforce and a decade of political capital sunk into it, the other side stopped is not an argument that wins meetings. The machine was now an answer to nothing, and nobody in the building could say so out loud. Almaz was also late. By 1970, the reconnaissance instruments were still being designed. The station was years from flying, and the Americans were visibly building Skylab. So a group of Soviet engineers went around their own bureau chiefs, talked directly to politicians, and proposed something opportunistic. Take the Almaz hull, which had already been built and tested. Pull out the spy equipment, fill it with proven hardware borrowed from the Soyuz, and launch it right now as a civilian station. That is where Salyut comes from. Salyut 1 flew in April 1971, 2 years before any Almaz reached orbit, and it was made out of Almaz. So the civilian program the whole world knows about was built from the military program the world didn't. And then, when the military stations were finally ready, they were launched under the name of the civilian program that had been assembled out of their own spare parts. The cover story was wearing the original's clothes. The first one never had a chance. On April 3, 1973, OPS-1 reached orbit and was announced to the world as Salyut 2. Then, the spent third stage of its own Proton, still drifting nearby, exploded from a pressure change inside its tanks. Fragments hit the station. The hull was punctured, the air went out into vacuum, and both solar panels were torn away. No crew had launched yet, so there was nobody aboard to lose. Moscow announced a successful scientific mission, said nothing further, and let the wreck decay until it came down over the Pacific on May 28. It was in space for 8 weeks and dead for most of them. Look at what killed it. Not the Americans, not an error by anyone aboard, not a flaw in Almaz at all. Its own launch vehicle came apart behind it and shot it in the back. The second one is the one with the gun, and it's the one that worked, so I want to be precise about what worked means here. Salyut 3 launched in June 1974. One crew reached it. Pavel Popovich and his flight engineer arrived on Soyuz 14 in early July and spent 15 days aboard, running the camera, doing the job the station had been built for. In August, a second crew launched on Soyuz 15, couldn't get the docking to work, and came home after 2 days. A third mission was canceled outright. That's the whole operational history. One crew, 15 days, on a machine that had taken a decade to build. The gun was part of a self-defense system called SHIT, which is Russian for shield, and it was not a gesture. On the ground, during testing, the thing cut a metal container clean in half. Nobody doubted it worked. The worry was what firing it would do to the station wrapped around it, because 19 tons of pressurized hull with 2 men inside is not a gun carriage, and the recoil had to go somewhere, so they never fired it with anyone aboard. The third and last one, Salyut 5, went up in June 1976 and did slightly better. Soyuz 21 docked in July, and the crew stayed until late August. Soyuz 23 failed its docking that October and came home. Soyuz 24 got aboard in February 1977 for 18 days. Then, in August 1977, they deorbited it, and crewed Almaz was over. 3 stations reached orbit. 3 crews ever boarded one. And on June 28, 1978, the Soviet government formally killed the development of crewed orbital stations at Chelomei's bureau. Why depends on who you read, and I'm not going to pretend the record is tidy. One account has the Ministry of Defense running the arithmetic and concluding that the time and resources a crewed station eats were not worth it next to automatic reconnaissance satellites, which by then had gotten very good indeed. Another puts it down to strained industrial capacity and a long-running political knife fight between rival design bureaus. Both are probably partly true, and neither gives you a villain you can point at. It's a budget line, a committee, and a bureau rivalry, which is how these things actually die. If that first reason is the right one, though, notice what it means. The Soviets killed their crewed spy station in 1978 for essentially the reason the Americans had killed theirs in 1969. Both sides spent years and fortunes arriving at the same answer, separately, 9 years apart, and neither could tell the other. The verdict itself was blunt. Crewed military stations at that bureau were finished, with no reduced version to fall back on and no revival scheduled. And because the whole program had been classified from the day it started, there was no obituary, no retrospective, no admission it had ever existed. The stations had been announced as something else. The cancellation was announced as nothing whatsoever, and the file closed. The part of this program I can't stop thinking about isn't the gun, it's the truck. To run a station, you have to resupply it. So alongside Almaz, Chelomei's bureau built a ferry called the TKS, and the TKS was really 2 machines stuck together. At the front, a squat little re-entry capsule called the VA, meant to carry the crew up and bring them home again, designed to be reused as many as 10 times. Behind it, a large pressurized cylinder holding the fuel, the engines, the cargo, and the docking gear. They called that back half the functional cargo block. In Russian, the initials come out FGB, and hold on to those 3 letters, because they're the whole story. The TKS was a serious piece of engineering, years of work by good people. It was also, in the most literal sense available, a failure. 4 complete TKS craft launched between 1977 and 1985. Every single one flew under a Cosmos number, which was the designation the Soviets used for anything they didn't feel like explaining, so the cover story got a cover story. The VA capsule, the crew capsule, the entire reason the machine existed, was flight tested over and over and never once carried a human being. 3 of the 4 TKS did eventually dock with a space station, and not one docked with an Almaz, because by then there weren't any left. They went to Salyut 6 and Salyut 7 instead, the civilian program. The decoy. They built a crew ferry for a crewed station inside a crewed station program. The stations were cancelled. The ferry flew anyway, under a fake name, carrying nobody, to the fake stations that had been built out of the real station's spare parts. And it's at that point that somebody at the factory made the observation this whole story turns on. The engineers at Khrunichev, the plant that bent the metal on these things, looked at the FGB, the boring back half, the truck, and noticed something nobody had bothered to say out loud. It was a big pressurized cylinder with its own engines, its own power, and its own docking hardware. It didn't need a station to be useful, because it already was, functionally, a piece of one. Everything a station requires before a single person can live in it, the propulsion to hold in orbit, the power to run, the fittings to attach the next thing, was already built and already flying. So the proposal was almost embarrassingly small. Stop treating the cargo block as a delivery vehicle and start treating it as a room. That's the entire fix. Don't throw the truck away. Park it. The obstacle was that the program it belonged to no longer legally existed, and the bureau that designed it had just been ordered out of the business. Which leaves the gun and the last thing Salyut 3 ever did. January 24, 1975. The last crew had been gone for 6 months. The station was hours from being deorbited, and somebody decided that before it burned, they would find out whether the thing actually worked in orbit. So ground controllers commanded the cannon to fire with nobody aboard. Remember that the gun was fixed, pointing forward along the direction of flight, and the only way to aim it was to turn the entire station. That's exactly what they did. They rotated all 19 tons of it until the barrel faced backwards, against the direction of travel, so the shells would slow down, drop out of orbit, and burn up in the atmosphere instead of staying up there as debris. They fired the station's thrusters at the same time to hold it steady against the recoil, which is a startlingly considerate thing to be thinking about while you test-fire a gun in space. 3 firings, by the best account I could find. A few hours later, they lit the engines, and Salyut 3 came down over the Pacific, with the gun still bolted to it, and that was supposed to be the end. Here is what the 1978 decision expected of all this hardware. Nothing. Not a reduced role, not a smaller station later, not an eventual revival when the money came back. The official judgment was that the entire line of work had no future at all, and the paperwork was written accordingly. Now the arithmetic. The Almaz program was killed in June 1978. A module, built to its ferry's design, has been in orbit continuously since November 1998. It is up there tonight, and in 2021, 43 years after the cancellation, a second one launched and joined it. Here's how that happened, and the thing worth watching is that nobody from Almaz did anything further. No one rescued the program, and nobody lobbied to bring it back. The design sat there being more useful than the file said it was, until outsiders came looking for precisely what it already was. It started at Mir. Across the late 80s and the 90s, one FGB after another was outfitted as a permanent module and flown up. Quant 2 in 1989, Kristall in 1990, Spectre in 1995, Priroda in 1996. 4 rooms of the most famous space station in the world, and every one of them was built to the design of the cargo truck from the cancelled military spy program. Mir is where the world learned what long-duration spaceflight does to human beings, and it learned a good deal of it inside hardware drawn up to service a gun platform, which is why, when NASA went looking in the mid-90s, the thing it needed was already flying. The International Space Station required a first element, fast, something to supply power, propulsion, storage, and steering while the rest was assembled around it. Designing one from scratch would take years the schedule did not have. But there was a design that had been doing exactly that job on Mir for most of a decade, and it belonged to a factory that now urgently needed the work. So NASA bought one, through Boeing, on a subcontract to Khrunichev, for about $220 million. It bought an FGB. They built it between December 1994 and January 1998, and they named it Zarya, which means sunrise. On November 20th, 1998, a Proton lifted it into orbit, and it became the first module of the International Space Station. NASA's own description of it is flat, official, and quietly extraordinary. Zarya is a United States component of the station, US-funded and Russian-built. Everything else up there has been assembled outward from it ever since. I had to read that a few times to be sure I had it right. A design bureau spent 14 years building a machine to photograph American military installations, and hung a cannon on it in case Americans came up to stop it. The program was erased so thoroughly that its real name never appeared in public. And the piece of it that survived was bought by the United States and flown as the foundation of a station Americans have lived aboard without a break ever since. It kept going, too. When Khrushchev built Zarya, the contract also paid for a backup article, a spare FGB, in case the first was lost on the way up. It wasn't needed, so it sat in a building for years. Later, Russia finished that spare as a laboratory module called Nauka, and in July 2021 it launched and docked to the ISS. So Nauka is Zarya's spare. Zarya is an FGB, and the FGB is the back half of a ferry that never carried a crew, for a station program canceled before most people watching this were born. There are 4 things wrong with the version of this I've just told you, and I'd rather say them myself than let you find them. The first one is aimed straight at my own argument. Zarya is not Almaz hardware. Nobody pulled a 1970s airframe out of a warehouse and bolted it to the ISS. Zarya was built new, in the 90s, to a design descended from the FGB by the Bureau lineage that originated it. That is an inheritance of drawings and know-how, not a resurrection of metal. If you've spent the last 15 minutes picturing a dusty Cold War relic getting a second life, that picture is wrong, and the claim I can defend is narrower than the claim that would get more clicks. The narrower one is the true one, so it's the one you get. Second, the stations are gone and nothing of them survives anywhere. Salyut 2 came down in May 1973, Salyut 3 was deorbited in January 1975, and Salyut 5 followed in August 1977. The thing that outlived the program was never the program itself, only the vehicle that had been built to service it. Third, the part built to carry people is the part that died. The VA capsule was tested and tested and tested, and it never flew a crew, not once in the program's entire history. The freight compartment inherited the future, and the thing with seats in it went nowhere at all. Fourth, on the gun. I can't actually tell you what happened up there. 3 firings is the best account I found, but some tellings say around 20 rounds went out of the 32 aboard, and others say it was emptied completely. The test is still classified 50 years later, so the count is unsettled, and I'm not going to invent one to give you a tidier sentence. You'll also find videos telling you the cannon shot down a target satellite. I couldn't find that in any dedicated source. The station was uncrewed and commanded from the ground, and I think it's somebody's embellishment that got repeated until it set hard. Can a machine outlive the reason it was built? Cautiously, yes. I think the honest answer is that it happens more often than we notice, and almost never in the shape anybody intended. The lesson I keep taking from this is an opinion rather than a fact, so take it as one. Institutions are terrible at knowing which part of their own work is the valuable part. Everything about Almaz pointed at the optics. They justified the hull, the crew, the 14 years, and the gun bolted underneath. That telescope is gone, and nobody misses it. What survived was the piece nobody was proud of, the component with no photographs taken of it, the one that existed purely to haul groceries and fuel. If you had stood in that factory in 1978 and asked which of this hardware would still be flying in 50 years, not one person in the building would have pointed at the freight compartment, and nobody saved it. That's the part that gets me. There was no heroic engineer hiding hardware from a destruction order, no secret act of defiance, nothing anyone would put in a film. Somebody at a factory noticed the truck was already a room, said so out loud, and the design carried itself the rest of the way, through Mir, through a Boeing subcontract, through a country that stopped existing partway through the job. Go outside tonight, somewhere with a decent stretch of open sky, and wait. Every so often, a bright point crosses overhead, moving steadily, not blinking, brighter than anything else up there. That's the International Space Station, and you don't need a telescope for it, just your eyes. At the front of it, leading, is Zarya. The gun burned up over the Pacific 50 years ago, and the telescope it was protecting never took a photograph worth 14 years of anyone's life. But the freight compartment, the part of that program nobody thought was worth hiding, is the module the United States paid $220 million for, and it has been flying over your house every night since 1998. The Cold War left a lot of hardware lying around with the wrong label on it, and the label is usually the only reason nobody ever looks. Going back through the archives for the mislabeled part is most of what I do here. Subscribe if you want the next one.